Coming up on today's episode of PSN, the 50th anniversary of the Paralympic Winter Games is set to take place next year during the Milano Cortina Games. We wanted to explore the history of parasports in Canada, so Dr. David Legg stops by to share some fascinating context in the history of parasport. You won't want to miss it.
Welcome to Parasport Nation with Alex Smyth and Nathan Clement.
Welcome into Parasport Nation. I'm your host, Alex Smyth, and as always, I am joined by co-host Nathan Clement. Nathan, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing well, Alex. I'm really excited for today's interview with David Legg, just talking about the history of Paralympic sport, but even so far this year, we have a lot of history being made right now that's going to be really looked at in the future as monumental moments for the Paralympic movement. So it's a really exciting day and exciting time for parasport.
Well, you teed it off perfectly. Let's get to it with the parasport update.
Now, the PSN update.
Canada's Paralpine team ventured to the storied St. Moritz for giant slalom action in Switzerland. Collie Eriksson stamped his first victory of the season, reaching his sixth consecutive podium in the visually impaired class. In the standing category, Michaela Gosling continued her strong form, achieving her fourth podium in a row after claiming a silver and a bronze in the GS. Meanwhile, Alexis Guimond maintained his perfect streak this year, earning 2 silvers in St. Moritz. Across the Atlantic, Winter Park, Colorado hosted Canada's development para-alpine team for the Winter Park Open. Notable performances included Logan Leach winning both the slalom and Super G, while Andrea Nelson claimed victory in the Super G and secured a podium finish in the slalom. Switching gears, Canada's track cycling stars headed to the snowy eastern townships of Quebec for the 2025 Track Cycling Canadian Championships. Victoria's Mel Pemble shattered the world record in the 1 kilometer C3 race, and friend of the show, Alex Hayward, triumphed in the individual pursuit. And that's your PSN update.
So tons of news to get through with that PSN update there, Nathan. Where do you want to start? What do you want to focus on? Do you want to start on the slopes or on the track?
I kind of have a bias towards the track as a cyclist.
Of course you do.
Of course, yeah.
Of course you do.
Shocking, I know. but I feel really with both sports, taking a look at the para-alpine and taking a look at the track, like we're still in a very interesting time where you have in paracycling, we have the start of our quadrennial, the start of the next 4 years. And then you have in para-alpine where you're kind of in that penultimate season that we were talking a lot about, where you're getting that confidence, you're getting that form, you're getting that momentum. And you're both in a very kind of similar position where you just want to start off strong. And you have Mel Pemble coming out here, setting a world record in a brand new event and category that her class is going to be having to do for the next 4 years and potentially longer, as they've shifted away from the 500 meter time trial to what we call the kilo, or the 1 kilometer race. So that's a lot of dynamics. And then you also have in para-alpine, where you have Alexis Guimond, you have Collie Eriksson, and you have Michaela Gosling, who were just in Italy a few days ago and doing downhill. And now they are up in St. Moritz and they're having to do completely different events and they're putting down solid performances. So there's just an incredible range of ability of these athletes. So there's so much that we can get into right now.
Well, and you left out your teammate, Alex Hayward, who not only competes on the road classifications, but was also on the podium for the track. That's another example of just having that adaptability, being competitive in multiple different disciplines, in this case, multiple different surfaces in racing. Like, it is remarkable to have that kind of distinct ability to compete in multiple different disciplines. And I'm curious for you as a cyclist, because you have that experience in it, is like, can you talk a bit about the different style or approach that someone like Alex has to take when he's going from racing on the road to having to race on the track? Because it's almost like a completely different sport.
Well, it's a completely different game. And first off, Alex is going to let me know for excluding him from that list. But an athlete like Alex, and just the resolve and character that you have to have, because as you mentioned and as you said, track cycling versus road cycling is two different games. They're really two different sports altogether, because on the track, you're only given one gear, you have no brakes, and you have a very short distance where you're just having to push your body to its upper limits, where with a time trial, obviously you have range of the course, you have range of gearing, and you can really control your pace a lot more. And they still have that same effects on the body, but it's over different periods of time. And especially knowing Alex, being his roommate on trips and traveling and just talking to him frequently, it's a tough game, because when you're strong on the track, and he ended up winning a Paralympic medal on the track, and Alex was close to winning a medal in Paris on the road, but he ended up winning a couple world championships medals on the road. So he's well-rounded, but it's really a tough learning curve when you're trying to balance those two sides of the game and those two sides of the sport. But it's just a test of character, test of ability, and test of how great that athlete is if you're able to balance those two things. But there's definitely a lot of learning and a lot of growing, because you really want to balance it two out. And just to give a little inside baseball with paracycling this year, usually with track events, track world championships happen in the spring. This year, it's going to be happening later on. So it's going to be very, very tricky.
Well, you talked about a steep learning curve in track cycling. There's also a steep curve in the corners of those velodromes, but we'll have to leave it there because we have to get to our interview, Nathan. I know I love my transitions as well, because as I mentioned at the top of the show, we are privileged to be joined by Dr. David Legg. He's the past president of the Canadian Paralympic Committee, a professor of sport management and adapted physical activity at Mount Royal University. Let's welcome him in. David, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for asking.
So I'm curious, because you just have such a wealth of knowledge and such an illustrious career, from being a professor, researcher, volunteer, the head of the CPC. Like, when you explore that world and that interest in adaptive sport, like, what was that initial spark of interest for you? Why did you want to get involved initially in parasport?
Well, thank you for asking. My dad had a disability, so I suspect that had a significant impact as a catalyst and as a bit of a spark for me to have an interest in it. And I also loved sport, although I didn't put kind of an understanding or an awareness of disability and then my interest in sport together, probably until my undergraduate degree at McMaster. And I did a physical education degree there in Hamilton, thinking that I was going to become a high school phys ed teacher, football coach, basketball coach, etc. And then in my third year, I took a course called Adapted Physical Activity. And again, an opportunity kind of presented itself to me that I hadn't really considered before, which was this idea of kind of merging, again, this interest, not interest, but I guess just, an awareness, perhaps an interest in disability, and then also on the sport and recreation side. So that was clearly the catalyst or spark that started this whole process.
Thank you for coming on today, David. In 2023, you authored an article titled The History of Parasport in Canada. In that article, you found that adapted physical activity in Canada dates back to 1918. How surprising was that, or how interesting was that, finding out it's been over 100 years of adaptive sport in Canada?
Yeah, well, and in particular, the two authors of that book, aptly titled Reclaiming the Maimed. What a great title for, an adapted physical activity textbook going back to more than 100 years ago. And it was James Naismith and Tate McKenzie. And so James Naismith, of course, is best well known for being the inventor of basketball. But Tate McKenzie was also, a really well-regarded sports person in his own right. And, as a sculptor, I think sculpting was part of his artistic background. But when I worked at the National Sports Centre in Ottawa for Canadian wheelchair sport in the 90s, it was in the Tate McKenzie building on James Naismith Drive, which is kind of an interesting connection back to this book that was written in 1918. And so, the idea of sport and recreation, physical activity, dates back to the early part of the century. Although, as you know, particularly the Paralympic movement is best well known for having its kind of genesis following World War II and then Special Olympics, not until the 1960s. But the idea and the concept of adapted physical activity, recreation, leisure, whether or not it was for the purposes of rehabilitation or for just the enjoyment of sport and recreation, dates back to the early 1910s.
And can you talk a bit about those early days of the adaptive sport scene in Canada? What did it look like? What type of sports were really being played up until the Paralympics finally took hold?
Well, prior to World War II, it was hit and miss, and there isn't a lot of documentation that actually describes kind of what was taking place. It really wasn't until World War II and these returning war veterans came back to various rehabilitation centers, and there's one in particular that gets a lot of notoriety in Canada, which is Deer Lodge in Winnipeg. That's where you started seeing the documentation of adapted physical activity and the creation of clubs such as, I think the Vancouver Duick Power Gliders was one. I think that was named after an auto dealership in Vancouver. And the Montreal Wheelchair Wonders, I think, was one of the first clubs in Eastern Canada that was primarily for wheelchair basketball. And so those are really kind of the earliest auspices, but again, primarily for people with spinal cord injuries because of the interest of the Canadian Paraplegic Spinal Cord Injury Association and the rehabilitation focus. And then it wasn't until really the 60s, but mostly the 70s, where you then started to see the advent of sport and recreation for persons with impairments other than those with spinal cord injuries, whether it's intellectual disability through Special Olympics. And, Dr. Frank Hayden, who was a professor at University of Toronto and Western, and was then brought down to the United States by the Kennedy family in order to kind of get the Special Olympics off the ground there. So again, you're seeing another Canadian provide some of the guidance and leadership, which is now a global sporting movement. But it wasn't until, again, the 70s where you started seeing opportunities for people with cerebral palsy, visual impairments, and kind of other disability groups where at least it was documented. Now, again, it could have been happening in, very much kind of grassroots level, but as from a documented and kind of a, photographed and you kind of see evidence of it, it probably wasn't until the 60s or 70s.
How and when did Canada first get started with the Paralympics, or at that time the Stoke Mandeville Games?
Well, that's a really interesting question because I'm working with, it's interesting to me. Not many other people may not find it that interesting, but I do. I'm working with the International Paralympic Committee to really understand and document the history of the earliest days of the Paralympic movement. Now, the first official Paralympic Games didn't take place until 1960 in Rome, and Canada didn't send a team until the third games, which were in 1968, which were in Ramat Gan, which is like a subdivision of Tel Aviv in Israel. And that was led by Dr. Robert Jackson, who is a physiatrist from Toronto. It's actually, and he was named by Sports Illustrated as one of the 50 most influential people of sport of the last century. But it was because, I think if I got this right, he invented microsurgery related to ACL reconstruction. But in addition to that, in addition to his kind of prowess as a surgeon, he also had a background in developing disability sport in the 1960s. So he was the one who took a team to Israel in 1968. But so going back to why I think this is an interesting question, we've just unearthed records that suggest a Canadian actually participated in what were called the Stoke Mandeville Games, although that name kind of continued to weave itself even when they were called the Paralympic Games. The Stoke Mandeville Games, which were held at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, which is northwest of London, is by many people kind of recognized as the birthplace of Paralympic sport, although again, it happened at rehab hospitals throughout the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States predominantly. We think there was a Canadian who participated in these games, but not under the umbrella of a Canadian team. And we wondered if he participated as either an independent or as part of another team, another country's team. And so whether or not he had shared kind of background from a nationality perspective. But I'm emailing what we think are his daughters to see if in fact it was this individual who recently passed away, who we think is from London, Ontario, and we think participated in one of the earliest and maybe the first Canadian to have participated in, what were the precursors to the Paralympic Games. So yeah, we're still figuring that history out.
It's fascinating just to listen to you describe kind of the process and trying to uncover and discover this history, because in something that I know Nathan and myself have been working on this show is we know all too well that, the record keeping, documentation, especially around parasport, it is very inconsistent. You get certain organizations, certain groups who really do a great job, but oftentimes this is based from very small grassroots organizations doing things from the beginning. Like, can you talk a bit about some of that? I guess like that investigative work you really have to go through. You mentioned it there in trying to uncover who potentially was the first Paralympian from Canada, but describe a bit more some of the process that you've had to go through to uncover some of this important history.
Yeah, I mean, well, part of it is just happenstance and being at the right place at the right time and knowing the right people to ask. I did my PhD with Dr. Robert Stedward, who was the founding president of the International Paralympic Committee. And so he was a professor at the University of Alberta in Edmonton when I moved out west to start my PhD with him in the 1990s. So the International Paralympic Committee had only been officially founded in 1989. He was the founding president. There was no real staff complement per se. And so, it was very much a volunteer-driven organization up until about the late 1990s when they created their own headquarters in Bonn, Germany. So there was a time where the IPC, again, very much volunteer-driven, and the international evolution of these organizations that ultimately created the IPC was, again, all volunteer driven. And if you think about the age of the individuals who were leading those organizations in the 1990s, so Dr. Stedward being a good example of that, they're all kind of coming into their 80s right now. And so a lot of these individuals had the records, but now they're wondering what they're going to do with them. And so the one story that I'll share with you is with Dr. Stedward. And so again, he was my PhD supervisor. He introduced me to my wife in many respects. He was at my wedding, and he's become very much a very close friend and confidant. When he retired as a professor, he had boxes and boxes and boxes of files from when the International Paralympic Committee was created. And again, the offices in Germany weren't really set up at that point in time to accept all these original artifacts and documents and meeting minutes and correspondence. And again, because it wasn't done electronically previously, it was all the original paper files. And so he was just like, I might just kind of toss them. I'm like, no, don't do that. And so he drove down from Edmonton to Calgary, and he brought just boxes and boxes and boxes of files with me. And then I asked our library at the university that I teach at, Mount Royal, if they would be interested in creating an archives, a Stedward archives. And they thankfully agreed to do that. And so we're digitizing all of these meeting minutes, and we now have them up online through the Mount Royal Library. But that almost didn't happen. And there are lots of examples of individuals who, again, are in their 80s and are the kind of the forebears of this entire movement, and likely have numerous documents that in some cases may be the only copies of these. And so we're doing our best to try to identify who those individuals are. And part of that project that I talked about with the International Paralympic Committee is when I had a chance to go to the Paralympic Games in Paris. But part of the reason I went is that we spent a number of days interviewing a lot of these individuals who were involved in the earliest days, and just getting them to record, similar to what we're doing here, to record their recollections and memories of when the Paralympic movement first started. Another example, if I can kind of share an example of something that I've been involved with, which is similar to what you're doing right here with me, was called the Stedward Talks. And so Dr. Stedward and I would pick a sport, essentially, and then we would pick people who we knew were involved in its earliest days and spend an hour talking about, well, how did this start? And, who was it that kind of initiated it? And how did it happen? And one of my favorites actually is about para ice hockey, or what was called sledge hockey. And we found the sister of the woman who kind of brought back the first sled to Canada and offered the very first, sledge hockey clinic in Medicine Hat, Alberta, going back to the 1970s, I guess. And so just learning about these things and then recording it and putting it online so that other people can have access to it is something that I've enjoyed doing. I think in many respects, it's because I have such a love and respect for those that have come before me and have really laid the groundwork for what is an extraordinary, exceptional movement in games.
as a Paralympian, I am so grateful and so honored for the work that you've done, David, and so many other people, because as a person with disability, I have the opportunity to compete, to race, and travel the world doing something I love. And for so many people, especially with disabilities and who've acquired their disability, it's a hard road to find themselves and really discover who they can be. But sport has created that for me. And I know for so many others, it's just blended a beautiful life. And we are so thankful for people like you. But I really want to know, is there anything from all the work you've done, whether it's with the Canadian Paralympic Committee, the research, anything that you take the most pride in for what you've done?
I would say things that happen locally at the grassroots level are probably where I take my greatest joy. Actually, so just prior to coming online with you, my wife works at a kindergarten in a small town west of Calgary that I live in called Cochrane. And it's a nonprofit kindergarten that is not only for children with impairment, but there are a lot of children that go to this kindergarten that do have disability or impairment. And they were doing a Learn to Skate program. So these kids are 5, many of whom have never been on skates before and are just wanting to learn how to skate. And she was short of volunteers, so I got called in to help with that. So just a few hours ago, I was on the ice with all these little 5-year-olds learning to skate, and I tried my best to assist wherever I could. But that to me is, I think, where I find the greatest joy, is making those connections to the individual or to the parent, and just seeing the opportunities that are presented that perhaps were previously thought not possible. And I mentioned earlier that I really loved playing sport as a younger person, and then I kind of meshed that with my interest in disability. And so sport did a lot for me. But as an able-bodied individual, I knew about these opportunities. They were easily accessible for the most part. If I wanted to play high school football, I just showed up and tried out for the high school football team, and they didn't really make any cuts. I mean, they kind of accepted whoever was there, and I was able to be on that high school team. While if you're a person with an impairment, it's not always just that simple. You have to know about where these opportunities are, and finding them is, again, not as easy as driving around and seeing the quote unquote Timbit soccer registration that's going to take place on Friday. And so for me, being able to present and be a catalyst and enable those opportunities for individuals, I think is where I take a great deal of joy. We run a program at Mount Royal University I teach at called CAPA, Children's Adapted Physical Activity. And every Saturday afternoon, there are 50 kids between the ages of about 6 to 12 who are partnered up with 50 of my students. They spend an hour in the gym and an hour in the pool. It's absolute chaos. But it's this beautiful chaos that if I ever need my bucket filled, I just go and, kind of watch and hang out and see my students kind of learning about these children that they're working with. I see these children that are developing relationships with my students. I see the parents who are able to kind of go off and have, a coffee and just a chance to chat and connect with and create that sense of belonging with that parent group and relax for a little bit. I think to me, that's where my cup gets filled now.
David, I feel like we could talk to you all day. I want to ask you one more key question before we wrap up, and I think you've kind of touched on a few key moments in Canadian parasport history, but what would be like kind of your top 3 or top 5 as the most important or most significant parasport moments in Canadian history?
Well, I would say, so if we're only talking about parasports, so we're kind of divorcing ourselves from Special Olympics and those sort of things and academia and academics, I would say Canada's participation in 1968 at the Paralympic Games in Israel, and Robert Jackson taking the team there. I would then say his hosting of the Paralympic Games, which were then called the Toronto Olympiad for the physically disabled, and that was in 1976 in Toronto. I would say the 2 fundraisers or initiatives that Terry Fox and Rick Hansen did. So Terry Fox in 1981, the Marathon of Hope, and then Rick Hansen, I think it was from 1985 to 1987 in his Marathon of Hope. I mean, those 2 individuals and then the program and then the things that they did really elevated, an understanding of disability and sport and kind of the ways that people with disabilities could participate. I would say more recently, Vancouver 2010 and the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And I would say that really created an opportunity, again, for Canada to elevate its awareness and understanding of para sport. And then perhaps, more recently, the Para Pan American Games, which took place in Toronto in 2015, and perhaps even the Invictus Games, which took place in 2017 in Toronto. And then will be held again in a month's time in Vancouver and Whistler. And so again, that profile and that showcasing of persons with disabilities and participating in sport and recreation. Off the top of my head, those are maybe 5 that I would have identified.
And they continue to push the movement forward, and like yourself, have been integral for a long time and continue to become more important as we move forward. David, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. We'll definitely have to catch up down the road and chat some more, because this was phenomenal. So thank you.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for asking.
What a fantastic guest, Nathan. I could have talked to him for an hour or more. Easily. There was just so much knowledge and passion there. For me, what really was so fascinating was him talking about trying to just recover and discover all the history of parasport and adapted sport in Canada, and just the lengths that he has to go through to try to make sure that it's all documented, because there's not a lot of documentation out there for those early days of the Canadian Paralympic movement or adapted sport movement. So the work he's doing is so critical.
Oh, it's just phenomenal. Just the work and the pride that he takes in all of this, as you and I know, and the listeners and viewers hear us talk about all the time. We're struggling to find information today in 2024, 2025. And going back to the 70s, 80s, 60s, 90s, even as we're talking about today, it's tricky, it's difficult, and it's very demanding, but it takes a great group of people, and it takes that kind of selflessness, that kind of humility to want to discover and want to find out this history, because we have a beautiful, vast world there. And as David was mentioning, and as you talked about, right now he's trying to find who was the first Canadian Paralympian. And that is going to just be an incredible look at our history, where it started, and having that monumental moment of understanding our history. Because as an athlete today, I am so lucky. I am so privileged to be in the position I am. And often you may even hear me complain about this or that or these other things going on here. And there's athletes that will have we have our complaints, and we have our things that we need to work on, and we need to grow as a movement. But to be where we are now is because of those people. It's because of the Davids of the world. It's because of everyone he mentioned, and even going back to 1918 and going back to over 100 years, and what James Naismith has done for parasport, and just all this kind of work is just phenomenal. And I'd love to ask you, what was it like just hearing all this kind of history that we're still learning today?
Oh, it's phenomenal. And it's fascinating too that we couldn't even simply answer the question, who was the first Canadian Paralympian? Like, that is something that should be a relatively easy question to answer, but in the research and the work that David is doing to really uncover that, it's really fascinating that is not easy to answer. So that truly stuck out to me, and it's something that I'm going to continue to think about this conversation as we go forward. But unfortunately, Nathan, we are out of time today, so we'll have to wait until next episode to chat some more. Thanks for watching and listening. Catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to Parasport Nation. Like and subscribe to the channel to follow us now.